Our army must be different from yours, Ibrahim Traore told the French chief of staff. Because our war is different from yours. That single sentence, spoken in the presidential palace on a scorching July afternoon, marked the beginning of the end of over 60 years of post-colonial military dependence. With it, Traore rejected not just a partnership, but an entire model of warfare that no longer served his people. Inside the palace in Ouagadougou, the room was heavy with formality and tension. Traore sat across from General Pierre Manan, head of the French military mission, alongside Burkina Faso's own defense minister, Colonel Kassoum Koulibaly. Manan had demanded this meeting after hearing rumors that Traore planned to revoke France's long-standing military agreement. He arrived armed with numbers, graphs, and veiled threats. He began with polite condescension, listing France's contributions. Nearly 3 million Burkinabe officers trained in French academies, hundreds of millions in equipment, drone and satellite, intelligence, and dozens of French military advisors embedded in country. It was an impressive resume on paper. Traore listened silently, betraying no reaction. At 34, he was half Manan's age, but the quiet gravity he carried made that irrelevant. When the general finished, Traore's reply was calm and unflinching. For 30 years, your country trained our officers, equipped our forces, and advised our commanders. And in that time, our security has collapsed. We have lost nearly a third of our territory to insurgents. Last year alone, 2,300 of our people's soldiers and civilians were killed. The implication hung in the air. French assistance had failed. Manan fidgeted. The Sahel faces unprecedented challenges, he began. Climate change, porous borders, terrorist networks. Our war, Traore interrupted, is not like yours. Our geography, our social fabric, our enemies are different. Yet our armies are trained like yours, outfitted like yours, taught to fight wars that aren't ours. He leaned forward, his voice steady. You trained us to call for airstrikes that never come, to rely on systems we don't have, to use tactics designed for cities and forests, not the Sahel. Manan's expression darkened. Are you saying French training is irrelevant? I'm saying your model failed in Vietnam, in Algeria, in Indochina. Forgive me, General, but we do not intend to repeat your mistakes. The room fell silent, thick with unspoken history. Finally, Manan asked, what are you proposing? Mr. President, a complete reimagining, Traore said. We will build a military that reflects our people, our terrain, our war. We thank France for its assistance, but the current agreement will end. Within 90 days, the meeting ended shortly after, with Manan visibly shaken, his departure quiet but seething. When the doors closed, Colonel Koulibaly turned to Traore. They won't take this lightly, he warned. France has intelligence networks across the region. They control supply chains, surveillance, logistics. That's why it's urgent, Traore replied. Short-term instability is better than permanent subordination. This was not a rash decision. Months of closed-door consultations had led to its sessions with veterans, regional leaders, African strategists. Again and again, the same truth emerged. The Western military approach was incompatible with Burkina Faso's reality. One officer, Captain Amadou Oharago, put it bluntly, we were trained like Europeans, but our enemies don't fight like Europeans. 2 weeks later, Traore went public. Standing before a giant map of insurgent-held areas, he addressed the nation. For too long, our security has depended on foreign doctrines built for different continents, different wars, different truths. Today, we begin building a defense force that is Burkinabe in every sense. The plan was sweeping. France's military presence would be fully withdrawn. A new national defense academy would replace training abroad. A research institute would be launched to craft indigenous military doctrine tailored to the needs. The international backlash was immediate. French media called it reckless, rooted in populism. Military experts warned of disaster. Aid organizations hinted at funding cuts. Inside Burkina Faso, reactions were mixed. Older officers who had climbed the ladder under French mentorship worried about their futures. Conflictory civilians feared the power vacuum. But among young officers, a quiet revolution stirred. For the first time, said Lieutenant Fatima, a rising officer from Kaya, someone is asking what kind of army we need, not telling us what kind of army we should be. The first challenge was intelligence. For years, French drones and satellite feeds had tracked insurgent movement. Now, they were gone. Burkina Faso would have to see with its own eyes Traore's solution. Human intelligence. Instead of trying to replicate expensive tech, he invested in people recruiting networks of trusted informants from local communities. These new civilian defense liaisons came from the very villages where insurgents moved, trained, and hid. They didn't need satellites to know who had crossed the river, or which family was missing a son. Technology tells you where the fighters were 6 hours ago, Traore said. A shepherd will tell you where they're going. It was slow work, but it paid off. Within months, the local networks produced more reliable intelligence than the French drones had, and more importantly, they brought communities into the defense process not as helpless victims, but as participants. The second challenge was education. For decades, Officer training had taken place in elite French institutions. The result? Technically skilled leaders who understood NATO protocols, but not rural conflict. The new Burkina Defense Academy would change that, focusing on counterinsurgency adapted to the Sahel terrain analysis, local languages, community relations, bush warfare. This wasn't just about tactics, it was about mindset. The new officers were taught that their role was to serve the people, not impress foreign generals. To protect villages, not parade in uniforms. To solve problems, not escalate them. There were setbacks, equipment shortages, communication breakdowns, sabotage attempts. But slowly, the new army took shape. Smaller, faster units with deep local knowledge. Patrols that built trust instead of fear. Commanders who spoke the dialects of the communities. They defended. It was a hard road. But 1 year after that tense meeting in July, something had shifted. Insurgent attacks had dropped by nearly 40%. Community police collaboration had reached record highs. And most telling of all, young recruits were now joining the army not for the salary but because they believed in what it stood for. The National Defense Academy in Ouagadougou was unlike any military institution the region had seen. Its foundation marked a clear break from tradition. Led by Colonel Samira Sankarou, one of the few senior female officers in Burkina Faso military, the academy focused not on theory or abstract strategy, but on hard reality. The curriculum prioritized practical skills, knowledge of local terrain, cultural fluency, and adaptability over rigid doctrine. Our officers must understand, not just how to fight, Sankara explained during the inauguration, but why we fight, and for whom. They needed to speak local languages, understand community structures, and approach security not as conquerors, but as collaborators. Training scenarios mirrored real-world situations, urban clashes, desert ambushes, tense negotiations in rural villages. Civilians were brought in to participate, adding unpredictable complexity and realism. Perhaps the boldest departure from tradition was the Academy's decision to include former insurgents, those who had accepted amnesty as part of the instructional team. They provided unmatched insight into the tactics, motivations, and organizational patterns of armed groups. What would be unthinkable in Western academies was embraced here as a necessary tool for building an army that could truly understand its enemy. As the first class of 120 officers began training, attention shifted to a broader question. What kind of military doctrine could serve Burkina Faso if the country was to break entirely from foreign templates? The task fell to the newly established Defense Research Institute, housed in a repurposed colonial-era building on the edge of Ouagadougou. Inside, military officers worked alongside anthropologists, environmental scientists, and community elders. The team didn't start with weapons or tactics. They started with a deeper question. What were the real roots of conflict in Burkina Faso? Western models had framed the problem as a fight against religious extremism, but that was only the surface. Dr. Aminata Douyo, a civilian leading the institute, described it differently. Our war is not ideological. It's about land, water, marginalization. Extremists exploit those problems, they don't cause them. The doctrine that emerged took a radically different shape. Military action would not be the sole solution, it would be one part of a broader system of community resilience, environmental recovery, and local governance. Soldiers were no longer an external force descending on villages. They were to be partners, integrated into the fabric of local life. This new integrated community security doctrine rested on 5 core principles. First, permanence. Military units would no longer clear areas and leave only for insurgents to return. They would stay, live with the people, and rebuild trust. Second, local integration. Officers were deployed to areas where they spoke the language and understood the culture. This reversed the previous policy of sending them away from their home regions. Third, minimal dependence on technology. Burkina Faso could not afford to rely on drones and satellite intelligence controlled by foreign allies. The new army would train and equip based on what could be maintained domestically. But fourth, environmental adaptation. Instead of treating the Sahel as an obstacle to overcome, soldiers were taught to move with it, using seasonal knowledge, respecting terrain, conserving resources. Finally, civilian primacy. Military operations would be coordinated with community security councils. These councils would guide priorities, ensuring the military supported not dominated local life. Western observers scoffed. One French analyst dismissed the doctrine as security romanticism, calling it naive and detached from battlefield reality. But the theory was soon tested. The Somme province in the north had been under insurgent control for years. Rather than launch a full-scale clearing operation, the government deployed a new battalion officers from the region, trained under the new doctrine. They didn't arrive in convoys or set up fortified bases. They embedded directly into towns and villages, establishing modest but permanent security hubs. These centers combined military presence with access to medical aid, community mediation, and market support. Each unit worked with a civilian security council made up of local elders, women leaders, and youth representatives. Security operations were built around community needs. Intelligence came not from satellites but from shepherds, farmers, and traders who knew every path, every rumor, every shift in movement. Patrols adjusted to seasonal grazing routes and water scarcity, anticipating how insurgents moved and when they struck. "We're not just protecting land," said Captain Mohammed Orago, who led one of these teams. "We're protecting livelihoods. If the water is safe, the market is open, and people aren't afraid, then we're winning." Progress was slow, but it was real. Markets reopened. Families returned to abandoned villages, attacks declined, and crucially, the people began to talk to report suspicious activity, to warn of potential attacks, to see soldiers as protectors rather than occupiers. 6 months later, the model was expanded to 3 more provinces. These were regions that had endured years of violence, where previous operations had only offered brief relief. Now, something was changing. There were fewer ambushes, fewer raids. People began to believe this time might be different. The transformation didn't come without setbacks. France's suspension of military aid created serious logistical gaps. Equipment had to be rationed. Vehicles were cannibalized for parts. Senior officers trained in the French system resigned, uncomfortable with the radical shift. Insurgent groups recognized the threat the new doctrine posed to their influence, and responded fiercely. In one early operation, an entire company was nearly wiped out in an ambush raising questions about whether the new methods could handle full-scale combat. Traore didn't flinch. Meeting with senior military leaders, he addressed the failure head-on. "We are attempting something unprecedented," he said. "There will be losses, there will be doubt, but we must ask, has doing things the old way ever brought lasting peace? Our people deserve better than recycled doctrines that don't work in our world." Unexpectedly, the world began to take notice. Military officials from Mali, Niger, and Chad began requesting visits to observe Burkina Faso's new academy and doctrine in action. Like Burkina Faso, these countries had struggled for years under Western-designed systems that failed. To stem insurgencies, Traore welcomed the interest and created a regional security forum, explicitly excluding former colonial powers. The Sahel Security Dialogue gave African commanders a space to share solutions drawn from their own land, history, and culture without foreign oversight. 2 years into the reforms, the results spoke for themselves. In regions where the new doctrine had been fully implemented, insurgent attacks dropped by nearly 50%. Civilian casualties fell even further. Most striking of all, population displacement began to reverse. Families returned to homes they had once fled in terror. Even France, once dismissive, began to reassess. A confidential report from its defense ministry, leaked to the press, acknowledged the unexpected success of Burkina Faso's approach. It concluded, while this model diverges dramatically from conventional counterinsurgency theory, it demonstrates notable effectiveness in its specific context. In the Western Sahel, something extraordinary was unfolding. Burkina Faso's military transformation was not only working, but doing so with minimal external support. That fact alone was quietly revolutionary. Ibrahim Traore had built a defense force tailored to local terrain, local knowledge, and local values. For the first time in the country's modern history, security didn't hinge on foreign aid or outside doctrine. It was a turning point, sovereignty, not only in word but in practice. 3 years after that decisive meeting with the French general, Traore stood in a very different room, at the newly built National Defense Academy, addressing military leaders from 12 African nations. The occasion marked the first Pan-African Conference on Indigenous Security Doctrine, and Burkina Faso's experience was no longer an experiment, it was a case study. "When we began," Traore said, his voice calm but firm, "we were told that African armies couldn't function without Western doctrine, without Western weapons, without Western training. And yet, here we are, not because our way is perfect, but because it is ours. It fits our land, our people, our fight." Across the continent, that message was resonating. Younger leaders were beginning to challenge long-held assumptions, questioning systems inherited from colonial rule. Traore's reforms had become a symbol of something larger, a growing movement toward real self-determination. A Malian general captured the sentiment simply: "We've been politically independent for decades, but security dependent? That isn't independence. It's just management." For the soldiers on the ground, the difference wasn't philosophical, it was personal. Sergeant Fatou Dio, who had served under both the old French-advised system and the new indigenous model, described it with pride. "We used to feel like we were carrying someone else's blueprint, marching to a beat that wasn't ours. Now, it's different. It makes sense. It feels like we belong in our own uniform." The shift in perception was felt deeply in rural communities too, where once villagers viewed soldiers with suspicion as outsiders, speaking French, trained abroad, and enforcing distant policies. They now saw them as neighbors and protectors. "They understand us," said one village elder in eastern Burkina Faso. "They speak our language. They sit under our trees, eat with us, pray with us. They stay, they listen." 4 years into the reforms, a notable visitor arrived at the Defense Research Institute, General Henry Claire, the newly appointed French Chief of Staff. Unlike his predecessor, he came without demands or statistics. "I've come to learn, not to advise," he told Traore. "What you've achieved here forces us to rethink many of our assumptions." Traore was courteous but direct. "We welcome partnership with France and with any country that respects our sovereignty. But real partnership only exists between equals. If we are not equal, then it is not partnership, it is dependency." That principle, equality, not subordination, became the cornerstone of Burkina Faso's new approach to international cooperation. They would accept training, equipment, even intelligence support, but only when it aligned with their doctrine, their priorities, their way of doing things. "We'll learn from everyone," Traore told his generals one evening. "From the east, from the west, from the north, from the south. But we will follow no one. Our security must grow from the soil we stand on." What had begun as military reform evolved into something deeper, a national mindset shift. The greatest change wasn't technological or tactical. It was psychological. The belief that Burkina Faso no longer needed to borrow its answers from abroad. It could create its own. 5 years after the first major changes, the results were undeniable. The fifth graduating class of the National Defense Academy stood in formation, young officers who had known no other system. They had never trained in France or studied European battlefield doctrine. They had learned from the land, from local elders, from war survivors, and even from former insurgents who had joined the peace effort. Addressing them, Traore's message was clear. You inherit not just a uniform, not just a rank, you inherit a vision and institution brave enough to question everything it was told. Don't protect this vision by preserving it in stone. Protect it by evolving, by adapting, by staying true to the reason we started this journey. That commitment to questioning, to adapting, was perhaps the most defining feature of Burkina Faso's renaissance. The doctrine didn't claim to have all the answers. It simply insisted that the answers must come from within. Despite significant international resistance, Traore's gamble had worked. The military was more trusted. Attacks in reformed provinces had dropped. Civilians were returning to villages. Security, for the first time in decades, felt like something local, not a service provided by distant forces, but a shared responsibility shaped by those who lived it. And yet, the reform was never sold as a miracle. The country still faced enormous challenges: climate change, cross-border arms trafficking, extremist networks. But instead of reaching for imported solutions, the military now tackled those problems with tools born from its own realities. In many ways, that simple phrase, "our army must be different from yours, because our war is different from yours," had become a national compass. What began as a defiant statement had matured into a philosophy. It now guided not just security strategy, but thinking across development, governance, and foreign relations. It was a declaration of the right to define oneself on one's own terms. Other African nations were watching closely. Some sent delegations to learn. A few began adopting elements of the Burkina model. In the post-colonial world, where power was often wielded subtly through dependency rather than force, Burkina Faso had proven a quiet revolution was possible, one that didn't reject partnership, but redefined its terms. For Traore, the reform's true success wasn't found on a battlefield or in a data chart. It was in the mindset of the people, an awakened sense of ownership. "Our greatest victory," he once said, "is not what we've built. It's that we believe we can build."